Hello everybody, it's me Scoop, and I absolutely called how MaXXXine was gonna turn out. Let's just take a moment, let's hit a quick flashback to my last video, let's just see what I said there. And like I've said throughout this video, the presentation is really not the problem with these movies, so I have to imagine it's either gonna be sink or swim with this more complex plot that they're shooting for. So funny enough, I actually wouldn't say MaXXXine necessarily sank or swam based on the plot, it more just treaded water. The film's presentation actually manages to stand head and shoulders above X and Pearl now that we've graduated from 70s slasher style to 80s thriller. And the biggest praise that I have for director T.I. West here is that this absolutely feels like an 80s movie. It's almost embarrassing for all these other 80s nostalgia features that have come out over the past few years that T.I. West could just pull up and drop a movie that, outside of visual fidelity, wouldn't look out of place in the 80s whatsoever. He's previously stated that a large part of the franchise's goal is to explain how cinema's impacted American society during different parts of our history, but if you ask me, they're almost better as time capsules, perfectly capturing what styles of films looked like back in those decades, whether it be the 70s, 80s, or the 60s with Pearl. Obviously, Pearl isn't set in the 60s, but like I said in my previous video, it seems very heavily inspired by the visual language of the early Wizard of Oz scenes, and that's more of a 60s tone in my opinion. He manages to copy things from these movies outside of just stuff like neon lights and 80s music, and actually uses sets, characters, locations, plot points, all that stuff that you would typically find in an 80s movie. For example, Kevin Bacon stars as a criminal who's also kind of a PI, but mostly a criminal, hired to track down MaXXXine, and he's introduced by inviting MaXXXine to a really fancy lunch at the top of this big old skyscraper, and that is just the most 80s shit I have ever seen. They have a chase scene through a nightclub, home video plays a big role in the way people talk about celebrities and the way they can rise and fall in Hollywood, and the film isn't afraid to do campy stylistic 80s things, like having the movie's title card be MaXXXine's license plate that just says MaXXXine, as she pulls out of a parking spot, instead of doing something like a big neon, piece of text that just says MaXXXine on it. It is very specific and very 80s, and it is just fantastic. I can't praise it enough. MaXXXine also broke the trend of these three movies having a what the fuck plot moment in the middle where I kind of just don't really know where we're going from here. The movie was fairly enjoyable up until like the last 10 to 15 minutes or so I would say that's a pretty big improvement. The plot of MaXXXine is actually weirdly convoluted in its setup because it's trying to give you all these different mysteries, but the answers to these mysteries are all really lame. As I frequently mentioned in my last video, I was really confused what the plot of MaXXXine was going to be based off of the trailers, and these weird plot mysteries are the reason for my confusion. This trilogy has no cohesion plot-wise across the three, so this movie's basically unrelated to the events of X or even Pearl, which is why I was so confused by the story seemingly going in a completely unrelated direction. Because it does. Although the trailer hints heavily that the events of X are crucial to this story, it's really not besides understanding what our main character has gone through in the past. None of the answers necessarily have anything to do with Pearl or the events at her house. So the mystery being set up here is that there's a serial killer known as the Night Stalker, and he's recently turned up the heat, and he's killing really rapidly, right? But after we see the Night Stalker's first victims, they immediately start hinting at the idea that this might not be the Night Stalker, it might be a copycat killer, which explains why his killing timeline has sped up so rapidly. This is a horrible introduction to a murder mystery, because we haven't even had any time to understand who the Night Stalker is, or what they're up to or anything, before you're already throwing us into the idea that, wait, this might not be the work of the Night Stalker. It could be a copycat. Because we have no idea how to differentiate the two because we haven't seen either of them yet. And in the end of the movie, the Night Stalker actually has nothing to do with the plot. They kind of forget about him because they do make it clear that these are copycat killings. So what's the deal? Why does he get name dropped every 15 minutes if he's not actually part of the plot? So there's also a scene earlier on in the movie where it's at night, MaXXXine's walking down an alley, and a guy pulls a knife on her and tries to mug her, or possibly kill her. My headcanon is that this guy's the Night Stalker because it seems like the Night Stalker was carving a pentagram into his victims with a box cutter, and that's what this guy was wielding. But it would also be really funny if this was the Night Stalker because MaXXXine immediately pulls out a gun and turns the tables on him, and then she makes him strip and lie down naked on the ground, and then she takes her foot, and we get a close-up of her absolutely exploding his nutsack, and every guy in the theater, including myself, made that face for about 5 minutes, and it was really worth it. That was horrible to watch. In the beginning of the movie, in two separate scenes, MaXXXine finds out that her co-workers are getting invited to this big, exciting, mysterious party in the Hollywood Hills. MaXXXine opts not to go. We see from the perspective of the killer operating like an old-fashioned film camera how they torture and kill these girls before leaving their bodies for the police to find and assume it was the Night Stalker. So during this scene of the filming of the death of the two women, I tried to solve the mystery in my head. I figured the Night Stalker, because at this point it wasn't clear we were following copycats, The Night Stalker was just an invention of whatever this organization was so they could pin all of their killings on it, right? And because this group had access to the unfinished film shot during X, and it was tied to this massacre, they sort of uncovered a hidden market for people who want something more violent in their pornography. And so that's what they were filming, and that's what they were selling. And they were probably after MaXXXine because she's technically the one who started this by starring in the first one. But I was completely wrong. Like, I was totally off base. That had nothing to do with what was going on. And the answer is a lot more stupid and a lot more boring. I'm not going to blame the movie for me getting the thing completely wrong and being mad that it's not what I thought it was, but I am going to blame the movie for not having a logical or interesting conclusion. MaXXXine's dad, the fourth wall-breaking preacher-narrator guy from the first movie, is really mad that MaXXXine has kind of gone off the rails, so his plan is to go to Hollywood and make a film about him getting rid of the satanic imagery in Hollywood by murdering porn stars. Hold on. Let me get this straight. Let me break this down, buddy. Your plan is that you're really mad about all the violence and nasty things in Hollywood. So you're going to make a movie where you film yourself murdering people in Hollywood on camera. Very clearly a crime, because it's murder. Not only are you being a hypocrite, you're being a complete moron. I mean, what do you do? What are you talking about? So, okay, let's be completely fair. I don't want to get too far onto the hate train, because I did really like this movie. There is an interesting angle to take here, that he's mad that there's all this sin and hate and whatever going on in Hollywood. They could have taken us down the route of showing how the church is hypocritical. They could have done any of that, but instead, once again, I just can't really find what the deeper meaning is that they're going for with all this. So because you have a mystery that's really poorly written with no deeper meaning, it's just this horrible, mangled story. Going back to this movie's positives, Mia Goth has kind of reinvented the character here. I like that she dyed her hair blonde after the first movie. I mean, that's just very fitting for the character. But they also make her much more of a badass who just gets shit done and doesn't take anything from anybody. She's a lot more larger than life in this movie, which is great, and so are a lot of the other characters. They really get to be, characters. They're very exaggerated. I could go on a whole spiel that would kind of boil down to Hollywood doesn't make them like they used to anymore, but a big part of what doesn't work about a lot of modern movies for me is that they try to be too clean and too realistic when you gotta make things more exaggerated and more exciting. You need your characters to be a little silly and a little goofy and a little offbeat to make them lovable and memorable. And this movie does that perfectly. Because that's really the thing about this whole trilogy. As much as I've sort of complained about either not really getting the story or not being able to find anything out of the story, not being able to track the characters' arcs, which, once again, still continues here, I really just don't understand MaXXXine's arc. I've given a lot of thought to it. I've had all these different possible explanations for what they're going for, but at the end of the day, none of those explanations matter because they're not exciting to me and it didn't get any emotion out of me while I'm watching the film, which is the whole point. You wouldn't have a bad time watching X. Might have a bad time watching Pearl, like I said. The psychological elements just got to me a little bit. And you definitely won't have a bad time watching MaXXXine. They just have these really weak surface level plots. So T.I. West came out and he said he wanted each of these films to be able to stand on their own. They're technically a trilogy, but you don't have to see one to understand any of the others. And I think this approach was his number one biggest, and honestly really only flaw in crafting this as a trilogy. More connective tissue story-wise between all three of these films would take this as a trilogy where I say, yeah, it's good, and I understand why you might not like it, but I would recommend it to, oh my god, what a breath of fresh air in the horror space. You have to watch these movies if you're a fan of the genre. So yeah, in summary, I really enjoyed watching MaXXXine. It just falls apart in those final 10 to 15 minutes. I'm willing to excuse the end to the story because the story is never really what had me hooked on these movies in the first place, and for 85 to 90% of the movie, it's very serviceable, if not enjoyable. The presentation and the amazing characters are really doing all of the work here, and that's okay. Bobby Cannavale, Kevin Bacon, and Elizabeth Debicki in particular, absolutely killing it every time they're on screen. They are wired into their characters, and they are just so much fun to watch. MaXXXine becoming more of a take-charge badass in this movie really also elevated her character and how much I felt connected to her and just generally enjoyed watching her go through the story. And like I said, it really only lets you down in the final couple of minutes. Not enough to ruin the whole film, but enough to keep it from being anything spectacular. It really does go downhill though. I mean, the final 10 minutes or so kind of feel like a fever dream in like the worst possible way, because you're kind of just, how did we end up here at the end of this whole trilogy? This is really what we're doing? So even with all of that said, I gotta give MaXXXine a nice, crisp 4 out of 5 stars. I just really enjoyed watching this movie, and the bad ending just didn't get in my way, which is so rare, and makes me like the movie even more in a weird way. I want to watch it again as soon as it comes to streaming. This is just a fun, flashy movie with a simple but solid story up until the end, really lovable and memorable characters, and I just highly recommend that you go see it. I'm definitely going to have to keep an eye out for what T.I. West does next, as well as Mia Goth, because her performance in this trilogy, this goes without saying at this point, is just phenomenal. I will add, this movie did have a few moments that got on my nerves, where it kind of felt like it was patting itself on the back too much. It was working a little too hard to show off Mia Goth's skills when we already understand how good of an actress she is. The fourth wall breaking antics are pretty cute, but in this movie they just get a little oppressive because there's a lot of them and the movie's giving itself a little too much credit. So yeah, like all three of these movies, your mileage is going to vary, but I think if you go in with a positive attitude and you don't get too invested in the story, you just invest yourself more in the characters and the presentation, you're going to have a pretty great time. So let me know what you thought in the comments down below. Have you seen MaXXXine? If you did, what did you think of the ending? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you feel kind of how I felt where you knew it was bad, just didn't ruin the movie for you? Or was it so bad that it demolished the whole movie and you don't like it and they destroyed the whole trilogy with this? No matter what, let me know. Thank you guys so much for the support on the last video as well. I worked really hard on it. I felt like it came out pretty good, and clearly based on, the views and the likes and everything, you guys enjoyed it too, so I really appreciate that. So with that being said, drop a like on this video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you enjoyed even more than that, and have a great day and keep it crispy.